Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar today, which is focused on the effectiveness of trustee boards. This webinar forms part of Mayor Brown's annual Pensions Conference, which is a series of webinars covering current and upcoming topical matters relevant to the pensions industry. My name is J. Dorisamy and I'm a partner and co-head of Mayor Brown's pensions practice. Joining us today are my colleague Beverly Cox, counsel in Mayor Brown's pensions practice, and our special guest, Rory Murphy. Rory Murphy is a trustee chair in relation to a range of pension schemes. He has also had a trade union background and works with employers and pension schemes to troubleshoot and help them resolve difficult issues. Together, we're going to cover recent developments and best practice that impact on the effective running of trustee boards. And in doing so, we'll turn to Rory with a number of questions to get his first-hand experience on some of the issues and the questions. Before we begin, I'd like to go through first some housekeeping points. At the bottom of your screen, you will notice that there are multiple application widgets that you can use. All of these widgets are resizable and movable, so do feel free to move them around to make the most of your desktop space. We are streaming this program through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please ensure your speakers or headsets are turned on and the volume is up so you can hear us. For the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wide internet connection, preferably with Chrome or Firefox browsers, and closing any programs or browsers running in the background that may cause interference. If your slides do stop moving along, press the F5 key on your keyboard. That's F5, or refresh the page. If you have any additional questions about technical problems, answers to common technical problems can be found in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. So let's begin. Over recent years, scheme governance and trustee decision-making have moved into the spotlight. This has been particularly driven by the pensions regulator, for example, the 21st Century Trusteeship Initiative and associated guidance, and the recent consultation on the future of trusteeship and governance. Events over the past year have also been testing for trustees, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had wide-ranging implications for funding, investment, and employer covenant. There is also new legislation in the pipeline in the form of the Pension Schemes Bill that will, once enacted, place further responsibilities on trustees and also require new areas of compliance. This will in turn be accompanied by extensive regulations and pensions regulator guidance. In light of these developments and the future trajectory of trustee responsibilities, it's going to be important for trustees to keep under review their trustee arrangements and procedures. Areas for trustees to consider, and we would add the importance to also take the sponsoring employer along this journey, include whether the trustee board has the right mix of skills and experience. It might have had at one point, but do the arrangements now need to evolve? How to go about making changes? For example, are the member trustee nomination and selection processes working in terms of getting the right mix of skills on the trustee board? And does there need to be a conversation with the sponsoring employer about the skills of employer trustees that could be useful for the trustee board overall? Are the governance structures and policies that are currently in place compliant with the requirement for an effective system of governance? Whether trustee time and resources are being utilised in the most effective way? There are many more and no one right answer. In our view, much will depend on the type of scheme, its size and complexity, its funding position, and a whole range of other factors, but it's well worth reviewing and planning for the future, and doing so at the opportune moment, just to avoid having to play catch up further down the track. So on that note, over to you, Beverly.
Thanks, Jay. Many of you will be familiar with the Pensions Regulator's 21st Century Trusteeship guidance that Jay mentioned, and its key messages and themes. The 21st Century Trusteeship guidance is a series of communications that was published on the regulator's website during 2017 and 2018, following a series of surveys and interviews with trustees the previous year. It doesn't create any specific new requirements for trustees, but the aim was to make the regulator's expectations clearer and provide more practical guidance in line with the regulator's statutory objectives to promote the good administration of pension schemes. But also, if trustees have less of an excuse for not being aware of what's expected of them, the regulator can perhaps be justified in taking a harder line against trustees who didn't meet those expectations. If you haven't already done so, it's worth taking a look at the 21st Century Trusteeship pages of the regulator's website, as they include some helpful practical guidance, checklists, and examples of the sorts of situations where trustees have met the regulator's expectations and scenarios where they haven't. The 21st Century Trusteeship guidance lists a number of key things that need to be in place to promote effective decision-making, and these are set out on this slide. Today, we're just going to focus on the two specific areas from this guidance that we really think do underpin what makes an effective trustee board, and these are the first two areas listed here. Clear roles and responsibilities and clear strategic objectives, and a skilled, engaged and diverse board led by an effective chair. So starting with the first of those, clear roles and responsibilities and clear strategic objectives. The responsibility for managing a pension scheme sits squarely with the trustees. All the various functions involved in running a scheme that are in practice carried out by others have been delegated to them by the trustees. The trustees are still ultimately responsible, so they must oversee those functions and make sure that they're being carried out properly. It's clear that the responsibilities of trustees are very wide-ranging, and they include the making of important strategic decisions, which sometimes have irreversible consequences for the pension scheme. Therefore, ensuring that they're well placed to carry out these responsibilities and make the strategic decisions that only trustees can make is essential to a well-run pension scheme. So it's therefore very important that trustees should have appropriate policies for delegating decisions and projects and controls in place so that they do not need to spend time on the detail of the administration, thereby enabling them to focus on the strategic issues that have most impact. So how do trustees do this in practice? A tried and tested route, as many will know, is to set up subcommittees or working groups, for example, to do the in-depth work on a project or in a particular area such as GMP equalisation or scheme investments. In this case, it will be important to have clear remits in place and certainty as to who the decision makers are. Or trustees may delegate some of their discretions in relation to benefits to a pensions manager or a subgroup of trustees. If trustees are able to properly free up time by removing some of their work from their main board agenda, then they will have more time to debate and carry out strategic planning, and they're then more likely to be better placed to deal effectively with whatever comes around the corner. Having said all of this, we'd be very interested to get your take, Rory, on the issues that we're raising in this session, since you will no doubt be looking at them through a different lens in light of your background and experiences. And this brings me to the first question. No one was expecting an event of the magnitude of the COVID-19 pandemic until it hit us earlier this year, and it seems to have taken many people by surprise. Do you think we should have seen this coming? And could trustees, in your opinion, have done more to plan in advance for the risk of such an event happening?
Well, I think the question is maybe not so much whether trustees should have had advanced plans in place, but perhaps rather whether they should have been having more awareness that shocks, the 1 in 20 events, do happen, and that this isn't just consultant speak. Perhaps we could have done more scenario planning and focus on the types of events rather than the most obvious ones, such as, for instance, a takeover of the sponsoring employer or a corporate restructuring, although these may in themselves be consequences of the events such as pandemics. Mind you, I think many institutions got caught short on this one. I think our fiduciary responsibility as trustees include anticipating events occurring within reason, and maybe we need to re-examine what it really means going forward. For example, are we focusing too much on the now to the exclusion of the what might be? A balance has to be struck here, and I think the pandemic has brought this home because we now know almost anything is possible, and trustees need to be prepared for all eventualities.
Yes, and what you say perhaps brings home the importance of thinking a bit more creatively about what kind of risks might be out there and incorporating them into the trustees' risk register. How do you think trustees might go about deciding the types of scenarios or risks that they should be planning for?
Well, Beverly, we know that we're in a globalised and interconnected world that we're now living in. And so there is an argument that trustees ought to be keeping themselves more widely informed about global developments that could be of material relevance to pension schemes. Climate change, I think, is a very good example of just this. And we know that it's an area that is going to be put on a statutory footing. In other words, keeping themselves informed of global events and developments and taking the time to have wider reaching discussions at trustee board level about how these might impact on their scheme strategies could help to mitigate risks that might not normally be considered, or at the very least keep boards alive to issues out there. I know from my own experience how much pressure trustee boards are under, and if anything, it's going to get worse. But looking at the issues that trustees have to manage due to the pandemic suggests to me that fitting in board time could make a difference in how prepared the pension scheme trustee board is for future shocks and the management of those risks.
That's a really useful point of view, Rory. Certainly in our experience, trustees and employers have faced a really challenging period with this COVID pandemic, and it seems that there are lots of unknowns on its long-term impact. In your view, has this been the most challenging situation you've ever had to deal with as trustee chair?
Yes, I think it is, but we can't forget the 2008 financial crisis, which the world had to deal with. It wasn't really that long ago. And we need also to remember sometimes that these things happen in cycles. But I would argue that this pandemic has been pretty seismic and the most challenging issue for anyone to deal with in recent times. It is such a new event because of its nature and very widespread global impact on just about everything that touches on our daily lives. And there's great uncertainty about its long-term implications. Equally, from a pensions perspective, it's been a challenging event for trustees to deal with on a number of levels, be it employer covenant, employers being pushed into distressed situations, and actions that we've seen taken by the pension regulator, including, of course, the recent guidance issued last week on distressed employers. The actions of governments and other regulators worldwide and virtual meetings, etc., have also had an impact. On the other hand, we could view this pandemic as having really only resulted in a change to the environment that we're all working in. I don't think the issues arising from the pandemic itself are new per se for pension schemes. They might, of course, be new for any given pension scheme, but the consequential issues aren't in themselves novel. What we have seen is that the issues are more heightened and more grouped together and perhaps not envisaged. But I think a well-governed scheme should be able to deal with these unforeseen circumstances when they happen, or at least that should be their aim.
Yes, I agree with that. Having the right governance structures in place together with a skilled and diverse trustee board should actually help ensure that trustees are well placed to cope with the unexpected.
Yes, definitely.
That point leads logically to the wider question of what you see as the key risks for pension schemes at the current time, leaving aside the pandemic.
Well, there's clearly many risks out there. Some we can identify and some we can't reasonably envisage. And I think a risk to the level of trust in pension schemes might come from members' lack of knowledge about their own pension situation, especially when they realise that they haven't saved enough and may feel let down. I also think there's a heightened risk of many employers getting into financial difficulties in the years to come, which will mean they are going to find the ongoing commitment to the pension promise hard to keep. This also means valuation discussions may become even more challenging for trustees and employers, and that could lead to a worsening of the whole scene, a strain on the PPF and a reduction in the sustainability of pension schemes. Global demographic changes will also play a role here, I think, and the possible increase in the concept of home working could lead to more self-employed workers who are not automatically enrolled into an employer-sponsored pension scheme, which could mean poorer retirement outcomes.
So a wide range of risks, and their impact will depend on the type of scheme and where it finds itself in its journey. We've seen in recent years an abundance of codes and guidance from the pensions regulator, and there's also a new Pension Schemes Act in the pipeline, which will give the regulator new and greater powers. The role of the pensions regulator has been important across many areas, and in particular in relation to what constitutes best practice. How influential do you think the pensions regulator has been in strategic planning by trustees?
I think they've been influential to a certain point. Trustees, of course, need to take notice and take on board what the pension regulator is saying, and they've helped set the scene, signpost the direction of travel and set out what they expect on a diverse range of areas. But this doesn't take away from the fact that it's ultimately up to trustees to carry out their strategic planning in a way that is specific to their scheme. I do think that a lot of what the pension regulator says on trustee governance, 21st century trusteeship is a good example, should be common sense to many and ought to be bread and butter for trustees, but I'm often surprised that it's not.
So moving on to the next area, this is the pensions regulator's requirement for trustee boards to be a skilled, engaged and diverse board led by an effective chair. The law requires trustees to be fit and proper and to have the relevant knowledge, understanding and competence to do their job, but you also want them to be motivated and engaged, have complementary skills and experience and to work well together. What you want to aim for is to have people on your trustee board who collectively have the skills, knowledge and experience to run the scheme well and who make good use of these attributes for the benefit of the scheme and the trustee board as a whole. The pensions regulator is strongly of the view that where there is diversity on the trustee board, this will lead to better decision making because of the different skills and experience that each person will bring to the board, and this can significantly complement technical knowledge. Turning to the role of the chair, the pensions regulator's guidance includes a description of the qualities of an effective chair. It says that the chair should be an effective leader with an independent viewpoint and should be capable of setting high standards for the trustee board as a whole. They should encourage active participation and be able to recognise each other's potential, the trustees' potential, so as to ensure their knowledge and skills are used effectively, and they should seek to achieve consensus. Rory, you have for many years acted as trustee chair in the context of a number of different types of pension schemes, each with their own unique characteristics. How do you use your experiences as chair to steer the trustee board in terms of strategy, particularly when faced with difficult decisions?
That's a really interesting question in terms of the trustee board. My trade union background has taught me always to be inclusive, not to rush things, to take people with you, and that includes advisors, and to recognise that every voice is valuable. In the end, though, as chair, you're first among equals. You only have one vote, and maybe a casting vote, but the trustee board and the employer, who may often have a role in appointing the chair, has a vested interest in the chair's leadership role, a role that is critical to the smooth functioning of the board and to the scheme as a whole. Having clarity on where the scheme is going and why it is going in that direction instills confidence in your board, your sponsor, your advisors, and of course scheme members, which in turn allows you as chair to guide the board to where it needs to be. And so you need to know where that is. It's a fact though, isn't it, that you can only really know if you are right in hindsight.
The other angle is that the chair also needs to be able to represent effectively the interests of the scheme to others, particularly the sponsoring employer. This can sometimes be a challenge when at the same time you want to maintain a good working relationship with the sponsor, and there can be consequences. For example, sometimes a change of chair is made by the employer, if it has the power to do so, in order to try to repair a poor relationship between the trustee board and the employer. Rory, if you were to be appointed in this scenario, how do you think you would go about improving the trustee-employer relationship?
I think that's a very pertinent question, and one that may well become more commonplace in the near future, as perhaps employers feel, shall we say, hard done by because of a particular way a trustee board has exercised its fiduciary duties during this current ongoing pandemic. Not all employers appreciate or understand, I don't think, the specific and unique role and function of a trustee board. And I always try to remember that my job is to be right rather than popular. Another question to ask is whether trustees are comfortable in speaking freely and airing their views to the chair if they feel the chair is creating difficulties or not listening. Trustee boards should be able to deal with these situations, and having access to the chair is therefore vital. But coming back to your question, vis-a-vis the sponsor, in these cases, the chair is likely to be an easy target. This is a scenario that I have experienced and I'm well acquainted with. So there's a number of things that I would prioritise. Firstly, I think the new chair would have to reset the clock to zero by telling all stakeholders that this is what you're doing and making clear that you have no baggage and are not making any promises. And also be aware that there may be some resentment within the trustee board if you've replaced a respected former colleague at the sponsor's behest, so there is work to do there. Secondly, listen. People often confuse hearing with listening, as in I hear what you say, but to listen is to comprehend and to engage in critical thinking, and this will allow you to understand what has happened and maybe why. Thirdly, don't jump to conclusions. Make up your own mind on the situation you've inherited and sum up regularly to all involved what you've discovered. And finally, resist the temptation to appease. What the trustee board and sponsor both probably need most now is reassurance and clarity from here on in.
Those are helpful steers, Rory, as to how to deal with what can be potentially a very sensitive situation in many respects. Moving on, one of the questions asked by the regulator in its recent consultation on the future of trusteeship and governance was whether all trustee boards should include a professional trustee. We know there are no plans currently to legislate in this regard, but it brings me on to this question, which is, do you think the chair of trustees needs to have a professional pensions background?
No, not necessarily. In my experience, there'll be a number of people with a professional pensions background, as it were, supporting the pension scheme. These could be in the shape of individuals on the trustee board, advisors, in-house pensions team, as well as others, and many of whom will or would have been professional pensions people. This is very helpful and necessary experience, of course. However, I don't think the chair of the trustee needs to have a professional pension background. What is really needed is a chair. What is really needed from a chair is someone who can coordinate, scrutinise, order and lead a trustee board to fulfil its fiduciary duties, comply with legal and regulatory requirements, manage risk and instill confidence amongst members. You don't need to be a pensions professional to do this, and there are many chairs out there who are not. Let me give you an example from my own experience. I spent many years working for the Royal College of Midwives, and I can assure you I know nothing about midwifery, but I didn't need to. I had 35,000 fantastic experts, and the last thing they needed was another one. What they did need, though, was an orchestral conductor, and that's the role that I played.
How do you go about ensuring that members of the trustee board are fulfilling their role as best they can? Do you think that a formal appraisal process is useful?
In my experience, I think one needs a combination of the formal and informal. Groupthink can be dangerous, so the chair having a relationship with each individual trustee can be key. I like to think that I've helped colleagues be better trustees by having one-to-one, open, off-the-record conversations. It's sometimes hard to admit that you're lacking in something if you think all the others around you are not. And of course, you may find that a trustee isn't fulfilling their role correctly, and that has to be dealt with too. A good chair, I believe, will see this on the horizon, though, long before a formal appraisal process, before it's an issue, and will be able to take appropriate steps to resolve the situation. Whether informally or formally, an appraisal is crucial also in determining what development needs an individual trustee may have, as this goes towards building knowledge and skills of the trustee board.
Developing this a bit further, how do you as chair ensure that all relevant views are heard and not drowned out by the more confident voices on the trustee board?
I think simply by being aware of who your trustees are, their personalities, what the dynamics of the board are. For example, member-nominated trustees might be on the board with their big boss. So by bringing trustees into any conversation, and above all being kind and creating the environment where people feel confident to speak up. Being a trustee is not easy. It's a great responsibility, and we should be grateful that people are willing to take it on.
I want to turn now to trustee training and skills. The Pensions Act 2004 introduced for the first time a statutory requirement for trustees to have a certain level of knowledge and understanding. And as we all know, this is supplemented by the regulator's code of practice and scope guidance. The Regulator's Trustee Toolkit is also a really comprehensive and accessible starting point for developing and maintaining knowledge and understanding, and a lot of trustee boards require all trustees to complete it. The 21st Century Trusteeship campaign includes further practical guidance on trustee training, including an example of a skills matrix to assess training needs and progress. So there's lots of resources out there, but it's also important to deliver training in a way that sticks. In our experience, a very good way of increasing the effectiveness of training is to provide training in a short session at a trustee meeting on a subject that's relevant to what the trustees will be discussing. For example, GMP equalisation or a proposed buy-in or buy-out. The trustees will then immediately be applying the knowledge and understanding that they've gained through their training. The regulator recommends that trustees annually assess their knowledge and skills and evaluate the decisions that they've made over the past year to help identify their strengths and weaknesses and the area where they need to build up their knowledge and skills through training. Some of our clients find that it can be helpful to get feedback from the trustees immediately after every trustee meeting while it's fresh in their minds, and they can then review what's been said and address any issues promptly. And it will also provide a good starting point for an annual assessment. The 21st Century Trusteeship Guidance also emphasised the importance of the trustee board as a whole having the right mix of skills and experience to run their scheme. Working out where there are gaps and setting up training to fill those gaps is therefore important. It's equally important to make sure that you have a trustee selection process that works and maximises getting the right skills on the trustee board. Trustees may have some control over that, where the appointment is for a member-nominated trustee. But also, when a vacancy arises on the trustee board for an employer trustee, the regulator recommends that trustees work with their scheme sponsoring employer to assess the candidates and advise the employer of the sort of person needed to complement the skills, knowledge and experience already on the board. It goes without saying, of course, that trustees should be engaged and motivated and apply their skills and knowledge to trustee business. The importance of reading meeting papers well ahead of the trustee board meeting, being available for calls outside of meetings and so on shouldn't be underestimated. Rory, what do you think current trustees can do about getting the right people onto the trustee board in terms of skills and experience? And how do you think diversity and inclusion can be promoted?
Well, one of our challenges as a society as a whole is the whole question of diversity and inclusion. And it's often exacerbated because institutions and organisations look at it themselves through their own lens, and there's no overarching, structured, coordinated approach to the issues. So really we need something major, maybe a Royal Commission perhaps. Now we know that the pension regulator is setting up an industry group to look at the issues of diversity and inclusion for pension schemes. So perhaps this may eventually provide a structured framework for trustees to work within. Specifically on pension schemes, trustee boards, employers, professional trustee firms and others need to search and locate diversity, reach out to all sections of society and conduct research. For example, how many black and minority ethnic scheme members are there? How many trustees are there drawn from these groups? And it's the same for those with disabilities or from disadvantaged backgrounds. On the more wider issues, perhaps we need to utilise the technology we're all now familiar with and allow for open trustee board meetings and maybe explore shadow boards to showcase what a trustee board does, always within the bounds of confidentiality, of course. I think employers could also play a bigger role here by making clear that being on a trustee board can bring skills that can only be helpful to your career and promotion prospects.
What about trustee training specifically, Rory? This is an area that's come to the fore recently, particularly in light of the suggestion by the regulator that it would expect lay trustees to do 15 hours of training a year and professional trustees 25 hours. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's really important for the trustee to avoid creating a them and us situation on trustee boards. Trustees, whether they're lay or professional, must be able to work together as equals, with each individual bringing their own skills into the mix and without any individual feeling of lesser worth. I think the chair has a key role to play in making sure that this never happens. But to your question specifically, I think that requiring different training hours in this way is unhelpful in creating the equals I talk of. However, I think it's important for there to be a marker or some guidance on what are reasonable hours for trustees to devote to training. And maybe this is more useful as a ballpark number of hours without reference to lay and professional trustees. I don't think this is the sort of area that merits legislation, and I would be concerned about what might happen next if this were to happen. Trustees and boards ought to have the flexibility to decide their own training programme its structure, and the hours it will take in a way that best suits them. And sometimes more hours might be required in a particular set of circumstances than others, depending on what the agenda is. But also, we don't want to find trustees are targeting a set number of hours per year as a tick box exercise, rather than focusing on their own training needs, remembering we shouldn't lose sight of individual trustee requirements.
We're getting to the end of this session, and I want to squeeze in a final question to you, Rory, if I may. You will have considerable experience, Chair, challenging your advisors to get to the right resolution for the pension scheme. But what's your experience as to how prepared other trustees are to challenge their advisors?
Well, generally, I don't think they are, and I think it's because they're not encouraged to do so. As I've mentioned already, the Chair has an important role in this area to encourage all the individuals on the trustee board to voice their views, and this includes challenging their advisors. We know, after all, that it's safe for a trustee to follow any given advice, and there are little or no consequences if that advice turns out to be wrong. However, ignore the advice, and it happens to be right, then the trustee is in hot water. So I think it's really important for trustees, not just chairs, to have the confidence and ability to challenge their advisors. Each of those individuals is likely to have a different insight and set of skills, and as a chair, I would want to encourage them to come forward and harness their skills for the good of the members. And this comes back to our earlier discussion about getting the right skills and diversity on the trustee board. With the right skills, they are in a position to challenge advisors and add value to the debates, as well as reach the right decisions and outcomes. Another point I'd like to make is the importance of trustee boards recognising that they should not be abrogating their responsibilities, unconsciously maybe, to their advisors. I think trustees are sometimes in awe of the knowledge of advisors, and a trustee board has the ultimate responsibility for making the decisions, and that must always be at the forefront of a trustee's mind. I think there may also be a temptation, as a chair particularly, to fall into the trap of thinking you're dependent on any given advisor, or that if you don't like the advice being given, it's time to move to another advisor. I think this is dangerous territory, and we all need to be wary of it. Challenge is, I believe, a key factor in creating an effective board.
And on that note, I would like to thank Rory for joining us today for this session. It's been really a helpful insight into your thoughts and first-hand experiences as Chair of Trustees, and I hope that those who have been listening will have some takeaways to consider from this session. I think it's fair to say that the pensions framework has developed rapidly over the years, creating layer upon layer of rules and regulations on trustees. The obligations on trustees is certainly far more complex than it's ever been. They have their overriding fiduciary duties to their members, and at the same time, they have to deal with and weigh up many competing interests: the sponsoring employer, the wider employer group, the pensions regulator, the pension protection fund, lenders, insolvency practitioners, and the like, depending on where in the journey the scheme is. We have seen many issues coalescing during the pandemic to varying degrees. To add to this, on the current trajectory, is that there is yet more to come, and so responsibilities on trustees is going to increase even further. For example, in the near future, we expect to see a new Pension Schemes Act and extensive climate change requirements, all placing ever more requirements on trustee boards. And so trustees, together with their chair, need to look closely at whether they are as a whole properly equipped to deliver on their responsibilities in a way that is compliant and in the interests of their members. In the same way that the pensions world continues to develop, so we think trustee boards need to evolve to make sure that they are best able to meet the challenges to come. This brings us to the end of this webinar, which forms part of this year's annual pensions conference. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you found it helpful, and please do get in touch if you have any follow-up queries. If you have submitted questions during the course of this webinar, we will get back to you shortly. If you'd like to get in touch at a later date, please use our contact details, which are currently displayed on screen. We look forward to welcoming you again soon.